Hello and welcome to another episode of Elktech. I'm your host Brian, and today we're in our second episode of the basic hardware and components of the computer series. So today we're going to talk about the motherboards. Last time we talked about the different types of cases there are, and now that you've selected a case, now it's important to go ahead and select the motherboard. The motherboard is the backbone of the computer, and it comes in different form factors itself. So you have your standard ATX motherboard. This is the one that most people are going to be using. You then have your micro ATX motherboard, which is a bit smaller than your standard ATX. It still is able to have all of the same parts and components in it. However, it's much smaller, so it can fit into some of those smaller cases. Your standard ATX is going to fit into your full tower and your mid tower case, and your micro ATX are going to start to fit into your compact cases or your slim cases. So then what you have is you have your ITX, and your ITX is really gaining in popularity because they're really small. As you can see from the diagram, the mini ITX, the nano ITX, and the pico ITX are just getting smaller and smaller. So your micro ATX or your micro form factor cases can fit some of those mini ITXs, and then your nano ITXs you're going to start to find inside of things like the Intel NUC, these really tiny little units that can basically fit in the palm of your hand, and your Pico ITX get even smaller. And these are also the types that you're going to find mainly in your all-in-one units, but there may be a few all-in-one units that have more of a micro ATX processor, but usually that should be more of a nano ITX. As you can notice by just looking at these, you have your ATX form factor will have a few more slots in it than the rest of them, and it just gets lower and lower as you get down. So your motherboard is the backbone of the computer. It houses everything. Everything connects into the motherboard. Again, that's what makes it the backbone. So it has multiple different connections on it, the first of which is the CPU, your central processing unit or your processor. This is the brain of the computer, and it plugs directly into this metal slot that you see here on the motherboard and is able to then communicate with everything else. Some of the other sockets that you have on the motherboard is your RAM, your random access memory, or what most people just call the memory of the computer. You have multiple slots. Again, right now in this picture we have a full ATX motherboard. Your micro ATX is only going to have 2 slots, and then as you get smaller and smaller you may only have 1 slot or a folded up version with the ITX cases. The other thing that you have on your motherboard is you have your expansion slots. You have multiple different types. You've got your PCI Express 16 pin, you've got your PCI, your AGP, and your PCI Express 1. These are all different expansion slots where you can plug in other things like video cards, sound cards, modems, so on and so forth into your computer, getting more USB ports, so on and so forth. What you then also have on your motherboard is you have multiple different chipsets. Of those chipsets, some of the most important ones to understand are your BIOS and your CMOS. So your BIOS, or your basic input-output system, is basically it's where all of the settings are going to be stored as far as how the CPU needs to interact with the RAM or with the video cards, everything that's on board, so on and so forth. It contains all of your protocols and things necessary for the CPU to interact and for your PC to actually operate before it gets to the operating system. Your CMOS, on the other hand, is typically referred to as being the same thing as the BIOS, but it's really not. The two work hand in hand, but they're not the same thing. So your BIOS has all of the protocols and things that it needs. The CMOS is where you store your settings. So if you go into the BIOS and you change some of your settings, the settings are stored in the actual CMOS. All right. That's also why when you look at the motherboard, you have a small battery on it. That's the CMOS battery. What that does is that trickles a small amount of power to the CMOS so that the RAM never actually loses power, so you never lose that data, and that's the purpose of it. If ever you have your CPU, you turn it on and all your BIOS settings are gone, it's 9 times out of 10 because your CMOS battery has finally died. Usually those are a lithium-ion battery that last for many years. Your motherboard also has what some may call rails or circuits on the motherboard. As you can see by looking at these right here, these are the circuits in which the electricity is actually passed. This is how your motherboard, this is how your computer communicates with each other. Basically, your processor will send digital signals through these rails in order to go to a different part of the motherboard and talk to one of your expansion slots or your RAM or whatever else it needs to talk to. The other things that you'll find on your computer is your north bridge and your south bridge. Your north bridge controls the high-speed access to the RAM and the video card. It also controls the speed at which the CPU communicates with all other components in the computer. The video capability is sometimes integrated into the north bridge. So your north bridge is going to help the CPU and direct all of the traffic to the RAM and the video card, and just helps with that whole process. So then your south bridge is obviously the opposite. Your south bridge is going to control all communications that are at a slower speed, going to your hard drive, your USB devices, your expansion slots, so on and so forth. So again, your north bridge is for higher speeds, your south bridge is for lower speeds. Your north bridge is in many cases now built into your CPU. Not all the time, but in a lot of them they're now being they're starting to be built into the actual CPU to conserve space on the motherboard and be able to add more things to it. So that wraps up our quick tutorial here on the motherboard. Again, just make sure that you know that this is the backbone. Everything else is going to get put into this, and it's really important that you then look at the form factor of your motherboard and make sure it fits into the case that you've chosen. Your motherboard is then going to set the tone for everything else that you're about to choose to put into this. There are going to be different socket types on here. There's going to be different RAM speeds that it's capable of, different expansion slots that it may have, such as a PCI Express 2.0 versus a 3.0. So you really want to know all of the information on your motherboard, because it's going to set the tone for every other component that you want to put in here, and every one of them needs to match up with the capabilities of your motherboard. Alright, so thanks for watching. Make sure that you follow me on YouTube, and also if you're not already at my website, go to my website. It should be in the comments below, and you can find the rest of the tutorials for this video series, as well as other tips, tricks, and videos out there for multiple other things from scripting to how-tos. So thanks for watching.